Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Larry Parks Show. I'm Larry Parks, and this is the Extreme Consumer Activism Show, how ordinary people get ripped off by the system. And tonight I'm going to be speaking about how the United States monetary system violates Jewish law. Now, it turns out that today there's a great deal of anti-Semitism in the world, and I think this is true for the 20th century as well, having to do with the money issue. And a lot of times Jewish people are somehow connected to the fraudulent monetary systems that we have around the world. And while it's true that Jewish people have been visible, it turns out that the actual fraud was put in place by Gentiles and that Jews had nothing to do with it whatsoever. But more importantly, the whole system violates Jewish law. So how can Jewish people be responsible for something that the rabbis condemn? Particularly, it violates a very important prohibition in Torah. And that prohibition is called Genivas Das. Let me just put up the first slide, please. This is my introductory slide. Let's go. This is, one just before that. The one just before that, George. This is really how the monetary system violates Jewish law. And the Jewish law, come back to me, please. And the Jewish law we're going to be speaking about is something called Genivas Das. Genivas is the Hebrew word, the root word is ganav, which is a thief. Genivas means to steal. It's the verb form of the Jewish word to steal. Das is your mind, literally to steal your mind, but really to steal your perception. Now, the next few slides come from a terrific essay that I took off the internet. It's written by a guy named Hershey Friedman. So let me just go to that next slide, please. So really, the Genivas commandment in Jewish law is a prohibition against deception. The literal meaning of Genivas in Hebrew is theft of one's mind's thoughts, wisdom, or knowledge. That is, fooling someone and thereby causing him or her to have mistaken assumption, belief, or impression. And it's really this mistaken belief or impression that the monetary system has, which is why, in its core, it violates Jewish law. Thus, the term is used in Jewish law to indicate deception, cheating, creating false impression. Again, false impression is the key concept here, and acquiring undeserved goodwill. Let's go to the next slide, please. The Genivas Das commandment goes beyond lying. Any words or actions that cause others to form incorrect conclusions about one's motives might be a violation of this prohibition. One does not have the right to diminish the ability of another person, Jew or Gentile, to make a fair or honest evaluation, whether in business or in interpersonal relationships. Come back to me, please. Now, this is a very strong prohibition. The idea is you're supposed to be honest in your dealings. And what I'm going to show you, without any doubt, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond doubt whatsoever, the money part of our system violates this Jewish law. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, on this business of prohibition against deception, prohibition against Genivas is included in the transgression, you shalt not steal. So in other words, it's part of the 10 Commandments. And Torah explicitly states, distance yourself from a false matter. And go to the next slide, please. Now this shows the importance of this prohibition. The sages believe that there are 7 types of these, and of these, the most egregious is the one who steals the minds of the people. And you'll see in just a few moments how the minds of the people have been deceived when it comes to our money. And finally, the next slide, please. Genivas Das is not a minor prohibition. One of the important rabbis says that Absalom, the son of King David, deserved death for violating the Torah law against Genivas Das. So, last slide on this one. Jewish law misrepresenting the very strongly held views of the founders on paper money and legal tender. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. At another time, I'm going to be talking about misrepresentations on the paper money itself, misrepresenting the provisions of the Constitution, and misrepresentation by banks. Come back to me, please. So again, what I'm going to be speaking about tonight is what the founders had to say about paper money. And actually the most important founders of our country. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'm going to be talking in particular about what Thomas Jefferson had to say, what George Washington said, what James Madison said, what Alexander Hamilton said, and Thomas Paine, and all of you know who they were. Come back to me, please. Perhaps one of the most important founders of our country was Thomas Jefferson, and he condemned paper money. He said it was a cheat. And he wasn't talking off the top of his head. He wasn't some country bumpkin. He was very educated about money. In fact, as the ambassador to France after the Revolution, it was Thomas Jefferson to whom it fell to negotiate with the British and the Dutch who had helped finance the Revolution. And so he was coming in contact in those days with the most sophisticated, most knowledgeable financial people in the planet. And so Jefferson's understanding of money was very deep indeed. And again, he had this very visceral hate for paper money, and it really had to do with something that happened in his life which really contributed pretty much to ruining his personal life, not his public life, for his entire life. And what happened was Jefferson was married to the daughter of a very rich man in the colonies. His name was Eppie. He was a plantation owner and a slaveholder, and she had 2 siblings. And when his father-in-law died, he left an estate with assets of something on the order of 37,000 pounds and liabilities of roughly 20,000 pounds. Now, to put this into perspective for you today, 100 pounds in those days was pretty much a year's salary. So this was a huge estate. In today's money, it would be like $100+ million estate. Both Jefferson and the siblings of his wife, because of the great disparity between the assets and the liabilities, felt comfortable in taking the assets into their own names prior to settling the estate. The law at that time, and I think it's probably the law today, is that if you take over the assets of an estate, you are liable for the liabilities of the estate. But again, the cushion was so great, 37,000 pounds in assets, 20,000 pounds in liabilities, they felt comfortable in doing that. The liabilities were owed primarily to British financiers in gold and silver, particularly gold. The assets were in land in Virginia. And so there came a time in the early 1770s when Jefferson and his wife's siblings sold the land. And in those days, people in Virginia didn't have a lot of money. And so the way they bought it was to, in effect, give back a mortgage, which they called bonds, and then they'd pay off the bonds. So Jefferson and the siblings took 37,000 pounds in bonds from the buyers of the property, and the buyers got the property and busy paying off the bonds. But then the Revolution started in 1776, and Virginia issued paper money and made it legal tender. And as what happens with all paper money, the purchasing power of that money started to approach zero, and what do you know? The people to whom Jefferson had sold the land paid him off with virtually worthless paper money. But Jefferson still owed the creditors in England. And the creditors, he had in a prior time, he had offered them the bonds that the buyers paid him. And they said no. They said they wanted specie, and of course, why should they take counterparty risks? And so now, pretty much, he lost the assets to the estate, and he still owed the debt. And so he had this visceral feel for what a cheat it was to have paper money, and he was indebted his entire life. These days, by the way, Jefferson is chided because he had slaves and he didn't free those slaves. Well, you know what, folks? They weren't his to free. They were really subject to the debts that Jefferson owed to the creditors. He wasn't free to dispose of any of this stuff. It was all hypothecated to the creditors. At the end of his life, he was pretty much bankrupt, and after he died, all of his possessions were auctioned off, and he lost control of the estate, Monticello. And so the whole business with paper money was a disaster for Jefferson. And here's what Jefferson had to say about paper money. Let's go to the next slide, please. He said, "Paper is poverty. It is only the ghost of money and not money itself." He said, but that its paper money abuses also are inevitable, and by breaking up the measure of value makes a lottery of all private property, cannot be denied. Let's go to the next slide, please. And here Thomas Jefferson says, in a letter that he wrote to Eppes in 1813, he says, "The trifling economy of paper as a cheaper medium, or its convenience for transmission, weighs nothing in opposition to the advantages of precious metals." He's talking about gold and silver. "It is liable to be abused, has been, and is, and forever will be abused in every country in which it's permitted." I mean, how clear can you be? Next slide, please. "Scenes are now to take place as will open the eyes of credulity and of insanity itself to the dangers of a paper medium abandoned to the discretion of avarice and swindlers. And the next slide, please. A spirit of gambling in our public paper has seized on too many of our citizens, and we fear it will check our commerce, arts, manufactures, and agriculture unless stopped. And finally, and very importantly, next slide, please. He says, I now deny power of making paper money or anything else a legal tender. Come back to me, please. Now, how strong could Jefferson be? I mean, like I said, he called it a cheat, and in every chance he got, he railed against it. And you know what, folks? Here's the false impression which violates Jewish law. Let's put the next slide up, please. So here's paper money, and here's Jefferson's picture on it. And I don't know if you can read that little print in the upper left-hand side. And it says, this note is legal tender for all, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm reading a little writing in place. It's really the legal tender provision for all debts, public and private. Come back to me, please. So even though Jefferson was adamant against paper money, spoke out against it in every turn, the people who run the monetary system in the United States have put his picture on the paper money as if he was endorsing it. This is a false impression, and as I said, this violates Jewish law. Now, what about George Washington? Well, George Washington was one of the richest men in the colonies. He also married a very rich woman. And George Washington, by the end of the Revolution, also railed against paper money. At one point, he is reported to have said that it took a wagon load of money to buy a wagon load of provisions. And of course, Jefferson wasn't the only one in Virginia to get hurt with paper money. It turns out that virtually all of the gentry, people like Madison and others in Virginia, when the Revolution was coming, they leased their land because they couldn't be there. The British would have taken it away. And the idea was that the people to whom they leased it would pay them an annual stipend. But then when the paper money came, that stipend was paid off pretty much with worthless money. And these very important founders, they got nothing. So they had personal experience with this. They weren't talking in theory. They weren't talking off the top of their heads. They were actually damaged about it. Well, let's see more about what George Washington had to say about paper money. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here, George Washington on the 1st of August in 1786 wrote to Jefferson, quote, other states are falling into very foolish and wicked plans of emitting paper money. Let's go to the next slide, please. Washington, in his circular letter of June 1783 to the governors of the several United States, wrote that, quote, honesty will be found on every experiment to be the best and only true policy, being convinced that, quote, arguments deduced from this topic could, with pertinency and force, be made use of against any attempt to procure paper currency. So again, Washington again is speaking out against paper money. And then he says, next slide, please. He says, I never have heard, answered Washington in August, and I hope never shall hear any serious mention of a paper emission in this state. So again, Washington again is speaking out against paper money. And then next slide, please. In the summer of 1785, Richard Henry Lee, then President of Congress, warned Washington of a plan formed for issuing a large sum of paper money in the next assembly of their state, adding as his opinion, quote, and this is, the greatest foes in the world could not devise a more effectual plan for ruining Virginia. I should suppose every friend to his country, every honest and sober man would join heartily to reprobate so nefarious plan of speculation. Come back to me, please. So George Washington, let's come back to me. So George Washington, again, the father of our country, was adamant against paper money. I mean, there can't be any mistake about his feeling. And by the way, Washington was he was the chair of the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson was away at the time, but Washington was one of the founders of the Constitution. And now we go to the next slide, please. And here we see, despite all George Washington's sentiments against paper money, here we see George Washington's picture as though he's endorsing paper money on our $1 bill. And again, on the left-hand side, it says this is a legal tender for all debts, public and private. Come back to me, please. So how much of a false impression can you possibly get? Again, with Jefferson and with Washington, with no uncertain terms, speaking against paper money, and now the folks who are running the monetary system, and this goes back a long time. And again, folks, none of these people were Jewish who did this. This was all done by other than Jews. And again, this whole system violates Jewish law because it creates a false impression. It looks as though these people are endorsing the paper money when in fact they were adamantly against it. And what about James Madison? Let's go to the next slide, please. James Madison, at one time President of the United States, wrote, he says, "Paper money is unjust to its creditors, if a legal tender to its debtors. If not legal tender by increasing the difficulty of getting specie, it is unconstitutional." Now, James Madison is one of the founders of the Constitution. So here you're having it right out of his pen. He says it's unconstitutional, for it affects the rights of property as much as taking away equal value in land. Let's go to the next slide, please. Again, this is James Madison. He says if paper money it is pernicious. He's talking about paper money, destroying confidence between individuals, discouraging commerce, enriching sharpers. Sharpers is what the word today would be the Wall Street people. Vitiating morals, reversing the end of government. When they talk about the end of government, they mean the purpose of government, and conspiring with the examples of other states to disgrace Republican governments in the eyes of mankind. Come back to me, please. Now, how clear could Madison be about this? Discouraging commerce, enriching sharpers, vitiating morals, reversing the purpose of government, conspiring with the examples of other states to disgrace Republican governments in the eyes of mankind. And in fact, in our century and in the 20th century, whenever this paper money collapses, and it always collapses 100% of the time, you always get a regime change. And so government, who is supposedly is to protect the people, is disgraced, and you lose your form of government. And now we go to the next slide, please. And here you see the $5,000 Federal Reserve note, and whose picture is on it? James Madison. Now again, this is an out-and-out violation of Jewish law. They're creating a false impression. This is a Federal Reserve note, and the notion here is that James Madison somehow would have countenanced this, when in fact, in no uncertain terms, James Madison really condemned this in every possible way. Come back to me, please. Now, the people that I've spoken about thus far, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, they are not regarded by the Wall Street people as really the how shall I put it? They're not referred to as really the geniuses when it comes to money. The real genius when it came to money, as far as the people in today's world are concerned, was Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton, as you may know, was the first Secretary of the Treasury. It was Alexander Hamilton who wrote the Coinage Act of 1792. And it was Alexander Hamilton who founded the Bank of New York, and he was pretty much in bed with the bankers. Nevertheless, Alexander Hamilton was against this as well. Let's go to the next slide, please. And here's about Alexander Hamilton. In June of 1783, Hamilton, in resolutions for a new Constitution of the United States of America, set forth explicitly. Now again, this comes right out of the pen of Alexander Hamilton, quote, "To emit an unfunded paper as the sign of value ought not to continue a formal part of the Constitution." In other words, he was rejecting paper money for the Constitution. "Nor ever hereafter to be employed, being in its nature pregnant with abuses, and liable to be made the engine of imposition and fraud, holding out temptations equally pernicious to the integrity of government and to the morals of the people." Come back to me, please. I mean, how clear could Hamilton possibly be? Liable to be made the engine of imposition and fraud. And that's what you've been hearing from me for the last 3 years, how our monetary system has really defrauded ordinary people. And in effect, it works to transfer the real wealth of society from the people who earn it, people like yourselves watching this show, to the people who create the money and move it around. That's the Wall Street crowd. And so even though Hamilton condemned this in no uncertain terms, let's go to the next slide, please. And here we see the $10 bill with Alexander Hamilton's picture on it. Talk about causing a false impression. Again, this violates Jewish law. So Hamilton, were he alive, were any of these guys alive today, Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, None of these founders would countenance putting their money on paper money. Come back to me, please. Well, how is it that paper money gets to circulate at all? I mean, why would anyone take a piece of paper in exchange for their goods and services? Well, the way it gets to circulate is through coercion, and the coercion is called legal tender. Now, I want to talk more about this in just a moment, but first I want to tell you, or show you rather, what Thomas Paine, another one of the founders of our country, had to say about legal tender. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this comes right from the pen of Thomas Paine. This is the fellow who wrote Common Sense, and he was one of the principal proponents of the Revolution, and says Thomas Paine, quote, "The laws of a country ought to be the standard of equity, i.e. fairness, and calculated to impress on the minds of the people the moral as well as the legal obligations of political justice. But tender laws of any kind operate to destroy morality and to dissolve by the pretense of law what ought to be the principle of law to support reciprocal justice between man and man," and here comes the key phrase, "and the punishment of a member who," she's talking about a member of Congress, "who should move for such a law ought to be death." Come back to me, please. Now, how strong could Thomas Paine have ever been? Talks about paper money operating to destroy morality, to destroy the pretense of law. Excuse me, he's talking about legal tender, not paper money. Legal tender, to operate to destroy morality. In other words, to force people to accept a piece of paper gussied up with signatures and seals for their goods and services, to dissolve by the pretense of law what ought to be a principle of law, and to support reciprocal justice between man and man. And he calls for the death penalty for anyone who should propose legal tender. And let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this little phrase, this appears on every bill that you have in your pocket. So you pull out any money that you have, and in the upper left-hand side, it says, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable and lawful money at the United States Treasury." Actually, these days, that lawful money stuff isn't there. This is an older one. Come back to me, please. So now all of our paper money has become legal tender. Something which Jefferson denied. You'll recall he says there is no legal tender power for the government, and yet Thomas Paine saying anybody who proposed that ought to be put to death. Talk about a false impression. So again, this violates Violates das. This violates the commandment in Jewish law not to create a false impression in the minds of the people. So the notion that they represent to you on all of the bills that somehow the founders, somehow this is in accordance with the wishes of the people who founded this country, and somehow in accordance with the Constitution, when in fact James Madison, who was the principal author of the Constitution, said it was unconstitutional. I mean, what's going on here, folks? I mean, how do you have this kind of deception? And again, this deception violates Jewish law. Now, the way we got to legal tender, by the way, in the United States, mindful that the founders were against it, that it wasn't provided for in the Constitution, it really came about as a result of something that happened during the Civil War. The Civil War, as you may know, was a very unpopular war. Lincoln had trouble financing it. They had raised the tariff to something called to 47%. It was called the Morrill Tariff. Didn't bring enough money. They instituted an income tax. People rejected it. And it turned out they couldn't borrow the money because it would have popped interest rates to maybe 10, 12%. In those days, the banks' portfolios were full of bonds. If interest rates had gone up, the value of those bonds would have gone way down. The banks would have been bankrupt. So if you can't tax it, you can't borrow it, well, what do? And the answer is you just print it. Well, why would anyone accept printed money? And the guy who solved this problem was Lincoln's very brilliant Secretary of the Treasury. His name was Salmon Chase. He said, well, we'll make it legal tender. Now, again, there is no legal tender power for paper money in the Constitution. In fact, the federal government, general government, does not even have the power to issue paper money. Forget about whether it's backed by redeemable, exchangeable, or anything for gold. They're not allowed to use paper money. And so in Article 1, Section 8, they give the government the power to coin money, And then in Article 1, Section 10, they say the states must make a payment only in gold and silver and can make a legal tender only out of gold and silver. But again, legal tender out of gold and silver is redundant because people accept gold and silver anyway. So there is no power in the Constitution for a legal tender from the federal government, and there is certainly no power in the Constitution for issuing paper money. So again, they had this problem during the Civil War. So Chase issues this paper money. It's called greenbacks because the backs of the bills were in green. And to make them circulate, he made them legal tender. And this caused a great deal of controversy at the time. And as you might imagine, there was a lot of litigation. And after the Civil War, Salmon Chase had become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And what do you know, a lot of this litigation percolated up to him. And one of the first cases, they came to him on the legal tender, and now he really spoke the truth. He said, there is no legal tender power in the Constitution. He said, we did it during the Civil War as a war measure, out of necessity. And so the notion was if they didn't create a legal tender money, then they couldn't have financed the Civil War, and they would have lost the Union. And so now he said that the Civil War is over. He said now there's no necessity at all for legal tender, and it's illegal, and that was that. But then something very bad happened. There were 2 vacancies on the Supreme Court, and Grant filled them with 2 railroad attorneys. The railroads owed a lot of money, and they wanted legal tender so they could discharge their debts, again, cheating people. And the next case that came before the court was called the Knox versus Lee decision, and now Salmon Chase, as the Chief Justice, was outvoted, and they said legal tender is okay. But Chase had the last word. He said legal tender is necessary, in a written opinion. He said, and this is a direct quote, he said, legal tender is necessary only for the purpose of dishonesty from the sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. So again, I don't have the image with me, but now Salmon Chase's picture also appears on one of our paper money notes, and again, it's a legal tender note, again, creating a false impression, and again, this violates Jewish law. Now, I'm going to have a lot more to say about how the monetary system violates Jewish law, but today all I wanted to do is just show you the pictorial and written evidence that the founders spoke against it, and in fact, today the people who put this in place are really creating a false impression, an out-and-out lie, in effect, to cheat people. We're right at the end. I want to thank you for watching the Larry Park Show. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to present to you. I hope you'll tune in again next week. Thank you very much. Good night. Please turn to the next slide, please. If you get a chance, folks, to help us continue with this, nobody gets any salary. We'd very much appreciate a contribution to the Foundation for the Advancement of Monetary Education. Well, thank you very much again, and good night.